On an otherwise ordinary evening, inside a modest neighborhood supermarket, a brief and almost invisible moment quietly unfolded, one that would later be described by witnesses as deeply unsettling and impossible to forget. The store was not crowded, just a few late shoppers moving through narrow aisles under bright fluorescent lights. Among them was a senior corporate executive, a chief financial officer of a multinational company, known in business circles for sharp decisions, long work hours, and a notably private life. He had stopped by on his way home, dressed simply, unnoticed, blending in like any other customer. Near the customer service counter, a young woman stood holding an infant wrapped in a worn blanket. Her posture reflected exhaustion more than embarrassment, but her voice trembled as she spoke to the cashier. In her hands was a can of baby formula. Store employees later recalled that she explained she needed to return it because she no longer had enough money left in her account. She wasn't asking for charity, only a refund. She needed the cash to buy diapers, she said, quietly apologizing more than once as if she had done something wrong. The exchange lasted only minutes, but it carried the weight of far more. The baby stirred, crying softly, while the mother rocked him gently, trying to soothe him without drawing attention. Other customers avoided eye contact, some out of discomfort, others out of haste. Moments like this are common, yet rarely acknowledged. But for one observer standing a few steps away, the scene struck with unexpected force. The executive had overseen mergers worth billions, navigated economic downturns, and laid off hundreds of employees through spreadsheets and forecasts. Yet standing there, he found himself frozen, watching a reality no quarterly report had ever captured. According to a store supervisor, he didn't interrupt, didn't reach for his phone, and didn't step forward immediately. He simply watched, his expression visibly changing as the cashier processed the return. The refund was small. The cashier counted the cash carefully and slid it across the counter. The woman thanked her, eyes lowered, and adjusted the baby in her arms. It was at that moment, just before she turned away, that the executive reportedly clenched his jaw and exhaled sharply, as if making a decision that had nothing to do with business. Those close to him later revealed that the man had been living alone for years, consumed by work after a quiet divorce and no children of his own. His days were filled with meetings, projections, and numbers, his evenings, with silence. What he saw in that grocery store did not align with the insulated world he had built around himself. This was not a statistic about poverty or inflation, it was a human moment unfolding in real time. Store cameras would later confirm that he remained standing there even after the woman stepped away from the counter, holding the refunded cash. Employees noticed he looked unsettled, staring briefly at the baby formula shelves before glancing back toward the exit. One worker later said, he looked like someone who had just realized something important, but painful. At the time, no one knew the significance of what was happening. There were no reporters, no social media posts, no announcement. Just a quiet pause in a grocery store, surrounded by the hum of refrigerators and the beep of scanners. Yet those who witnessed it sensed that something had shifted. The air felt heavier, more serious, as if the moment demanded a response. Within seconds, the woman moved toward the diaper aisle, counting the money in her hand, clearly calculating what she could afford. The executive followed at a distance, unnoticed, still wrestling with his thoughts. To him, the cost of that formula was insignificant. But the meaning behind it, what it represented for a mother forced to choose between feeding her baby and keeping him dry, was anything but small. This was not yet a story of generosity or transformation. It was simply the moment before action, the point where awareness collides with choice. A moment that could have ended like countless others, forgotten by morning. Instead, it became the beginning of a decision that would alter not just one life, but many, starting with his own. After the woman stepped away from the counter, believing the interaction was over, the executive remained still for a moment longer, as if weighing a choice that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with responsibility. Then, without drawing attention to himself, he approached the cashier. His voice was calm and controlled, the same tone he used in boardrooms, but this time it carried hesitation. He asked a simple question: whether the return had already been processed. When the cashier nodded, he asked her to ring the formula up again, along with the most expensive brand of diapers, wipes, and a few basic groceries nearby. The cashier hesitated, confused, before realizing what he meant. She glanced toward the aisle where the woman had gone and then back at the man, who quietly slid his card across the counter. No speech, no explanation. Just a request to put everything in a single bag. According to staff later interviewed, he did not ask for a receipt and did not want his name attached to the purchase. He only asked one thing: that the items be returned to the woman before she reached the checkout. But as the cashier prepared the bag, the executive changed his mind. He picked it up himself and walked slowly toward the aisle, stopping a few steps away. He did not want to startle her or embarrass her. When he finally spoke, it was not as a wealthy benefactor, but as another human being. He told her the formula had already been paid for and that she should not return it. At first, the woman assumed there had been a mistake. She shook her head and said she couldn't accept it. She insisted someone else might need it more. What followed was not a dramatic exchange, but a quiet conversation marked by pauses and restraint. The executive explained that he had seen what happened at the counter and that he simply wanted to help. He did not offer pity. He did not ask invasive questions. Still, the woman began to explain herself, almost reflexively, as people often do when they feel judged. She spoke about losing her job after her baby was born, about rising rent, about choosing formula because breastfeeding was no longer medically possible. Her words came carefully, as if she were afraid of saying too much. He listened without interrupting. Witnesses later said this was the moment when his posture changed entirely. The urgency he carried into meetings was gone. He asked her how old the baby was. He asked whether she had family nearby. He asked what kind of work she had done before. These were not interview questions, but they were not casual either. They were the questions of someone trying to understand the full picture rather than the headline. When she mentioned struggling to find childcare, he paused. He told her his company partnered with several local nonprofits and childcare programs. He did not promise anything he could not deliver, but he offered to connect her with resources. Then, in a move that surprised even the store employees, he offered her a card. Not his personal business card, but one printed specifically for community outreach, with no title attached. On the back, he wrote a time and date and told her to call. The woman hesitated again. She had heard promises before, she said softly. He acknowledged that and told her she was free to ignore the card if she chose. The help, he said, did not come with expectations. But he added one thing that stayed with her: you didn't do anything wrong by trying to feed your child. Before leaving, he insisted she take the groceries as well. When she finally accepted, her relief was visible, but so was her dignity. There were no tears, no dramatic gratitude. Just a quiet thank you and a nod that carried more weight than words. The baby, now calmer, slept through most of it. Later that evening, after returning to an empty home, the executive reportedly replayed the encounter in his mind. He had spent years measuring impact through balance sheets and forecasts, yet this single interaction felt more consequential than many deals he had closed. The next morning, he followed through. He contacted his company's social responsibility team, not for publicity, but to remove obstacles. Within days, the woman had access to subsidized childcare, temporary financial assistance, and an interview for a role that matched her previous experience. What began as an impulse at a grocery store became a deliberate commitment. For the executive, it was no longer about one purchase or one family. It was about confronting a gap between success as defined by numbers and success as measured by lives changed. In the days that followed, the quiet encounter inside the grocery store began to reveal consequences far larger than anyone involved initially expected. The woman made the call, not immediately, but after several hours of hesitation. When she did, the voice on the other end treated her not as a charity case, but as a professional with experience, potential, and value. Within a week, she was connected to a local childcare partner that covered most of her costs during working hours, removing the single largest barrier that had kept her unemployed. Shortly after that, she interviewed for a position aligned with her previous administrative background: flexible hours, remote options, and full benefits. She got the job. For the first time in months, stability replaced survival. She no longer had to calculate every purchase in her head or choose between essentials. Formula was no longer a crisis item. Diapers were no longer rationed. The change did not happen overnight, and it was not framed as a miracle, but it was real, measurable, and lasting. She later shared with a caseworker that the most powerful part of the experience was not the financial help, but the moment someone looked at her and said she had done nothing wrong. Meanwhile, the executive returned to his routine, but something in that routine no longer fit the same way. Colleagues noticed subtle changes. He began asking different questions in meetings, about employee retention at lower wage levels, about parental leave policies, about emergency assistance programs that existed on paper but were difficult to access in practice. He requested data, not for investor decks, but to identify friction points where people quietly fell through the cracks. Within a month, he approved the expansion of a hardship support fund that had previously been underused and underfunded. He pushed for simplified access, fewer forms, and faster approvals. He also insisted the program remain internal and low profile. There would be no press releases, no branding, no speeches. If it needs publicity to exist, he reportedly said, it's probably not designed for the people who need it most. The grocery store incident eventually reached others, not through corporate channels, but through ordinary conversation. A cashier mentioned it to a friend. A supervisor shared it with a family member. The story traveled quietly, changing slightly with each retelling, but always carrying the same core truth. Someone with power noticed, and then acted. When it finally surfaced more publicly, it was framed not as a heroic act, but as a rare interruption of indifference. When asked about it later, the executive did not deny the story, but he resisted the label of generosity. He spoke instead about proximity. He explained that for years, he had made decisions affecting thousands of employees without ever seeing the most fragile moments of their lives. Distance makes everything abstract, he said. Up close, there's no such thing as abstract. Privately, those close to him noted another shift. The loneliness that had defined his personal life had not vanished, but it had been challenged. He began volunteering time with community partners his company supported, attending without cameras or introductions. He listened more than he spoke. For someone accustomed to control, this was a significant change. He later admitted that the grocery store moment forced him to confront how narrow his definition of success had become. For the woman, life did not become perfect. There were still long days, sick nights, and constant responsibility. But there was also momentum. She was no longer trapped in a cycle where one unexpected expense could undo everything. She began planning beyond the next week, then beyond the next month. Stability allowed dignity to return, and dignity allowed confidence to grow. Months later, she sent a short message to the outreach number she had been given. It was not a thank you note in the traditional sense. It simply said that her child was healthy, that she was working, and that she hoped one day to help someone else the way she had been helped. There was no response expected, and none was requested. What remained was a lesson that resisted simplification. This was not a story about wealth saving poverty, or kindness fixing systemic failure. It was about attention, about what happens when someone in a position to walk past a problem chooses instead to stop, observe, and take responsibility beyond obligation. One moment in a grocery store did not change the world, but it changed a trajectory. And sometimes, that is how real change begins, not loudly, not publicly, but decisively, when someone finally chooses to see what is right in front of them and act accordingly.